Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research. My name is Brenda Gladstone, and I'm the interim director of the center. And it's my pleasure to introduce the first seminar of the fall season of this academic year, which is one of my favorites because it's by the award winner for the 24-25 year of the Joan Eakin Award for Excellence in a Methodological Qualitative Doctoral Dissertation. And it's named after Joan Eakin, who is in the audience with us today and will no doubt have a question or two at the end of this. So we're really pleased that she could be with us. A couple of housekeeping details before we go further. We are recording the session, so hopefully that is okay with everyone. And we're really grateful that Dr. Kim Collins was willing to have this session recorded so people can access it after. And I also would ask that during her presentation, we turn cameras and mics off, but we can turn them back on at the end of the session when we have the question and answer period and then the discussion of Kim's work. So she'll be presenting somewhere up to 45 minutes, and then we'll have the remainder of the time for discussion. And we will be here until 1:30. So there'll be plenty of time to discuss what you're hearing. That's all I really wanted to say for now. And then I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Fiona Webster from Western University, who is also a CQ Fellow and is the chair of our awards committee. And she'll tell you a little bit about how they came to the decision to award this particular dissertation, this award, and then turn it over to Kim. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenda. Well, it's a real honor to be here on behalf of the awards committee. And I just want to quickly begin by recognizing the other committee members. So Shan Mohammed, Amaya Perez Brumer, and Alan Martino. So there was an outstanding group of dissertations that we received to review this year. And so I'm very pleased to be presenting Dr. Kim Collins, who was the award winner for her dissertation, Feeling Climate Change, Experiences of Ecological Emotions on Urban Farms. And this is a critical post-human ethnography. So, you know, very interesting methodologically, and that's how we choose the dissertation award winner. It's on the basis of innovation and really high rigorous quality in terms of the methodology, of course. So I want to share with you some comments that the award committee had to say about Dr. Collins' work. So Dr. Collins' dissertation was compelling, innovative, and deeply insightful in its analysis. The theoretical chapters, which were extraordinarily thoughtful and well laid out, blended effortlessly into the methodological description. In particular, the notion of relationality and human more than human interconnection for critical public health was very intriguing. Chapter 4 was outstanding, moving beyond the rigid scientific descriptions of methodological recipes, this is her term, to incorporate reflexive jolting, pictures, and descriptions of relationships with community partners. Some of the descriptions were almost phenomenological in nature. The use of composting as an analogy for data analysis was fascinating. We were also intrigued by the use of volunteering labor on the urban farm as a form of compensation and the use of soundscapes as data. Dr. Collins called attention to the centrality of relationships, interconnections, etc., in the theoretical chapters and embodied these concepts in the conduct of the research. This felt highly innovative to all of us and relational, challenging the conventions of a traditional doctoral project. So with that, let me turn you over to Dr. Collins to talk more about her work.
Whew, what a lovely introduction. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you today. I'm just going to share some slides. Just give me a quick moment. Okay, can I confirm that everyone can see my slides? There's not an issue.
Looks great.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending today's session. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research and to the award selection committee. It's a true honor to have been selected for this award. I'd also like to thank my doctoral supervisors, Dr. Lori Ross and Sarah Elton, and my committee member, Dr. Carla Rice. And I would like to thank Dr. Brenda Gladstone and Tenzin Butsang for organizing this session. Today, I'll be sharing the methodological contributions of my dissertation, Feeling Climate Change, which explored emotional responses to climate change on an urban farm. I'm calling this presentation Feeling with Methodology, Composting with Critical Posthuman Ethnography. And what I hope to offer today is not a set of tidy conclusions or best practices, but a provocation. I want to think with all of you about how methodology feels in practice and how we might compost our way towards methodologies capable of holding complexity, discomfort, and interdependence at a time of ecological change. A brief access note before I begin. To bring CRIP cultural practices into action, I will be describing all of the images on the slides. Here's a roadmap of where I hope we're going to go this afternoon. I'll start by briefly situating my project and its stakes, explaining how it emerged from overlapping concerns, both personal and scholarly. Next, I'll introduce critical posthuman ethnography as a theoretical orientation and a set of methodological practices. From there, I'll walk you through my methods in practice, what I did on the ground at my research site, how I generated data, how relationships and ethics were navigated, and how human and more than human actors were considered. And I'll describe the constellation of methods I employed. And then I'll turn to the process of analysis, particularly my dissatisfaction with traditional coding and how I came to develop a method I call composting with theory, which draws from the work of Barad, Haraway, and Jackson and Mazai. And finally, I'll end with some unresolved methodological questions, tensions that I'm still holding and would love to discuss collectively. Throughout, I hope to foreground methodology as a deeply ethical and ontological practice, one that shapes how we come to know, feel, and relate to one another in a time of climate change. Before I get into the details of the project itself, I want to take a moment to situate myself in relation to the work. I believe, following scholars like Donna Haraway and Rosie Braidotti, that methodology isn't something abstract. It emerges from specific histories, places, body minds, communities. It matters where we think from and who we think with, as this fundamentally shapes how we come to know the world. As a white settler raised on a small rural family farm, located within the Between the Lakes Treaty, Treaty Number 3, which borders the unceded Haudenosaunee territory known in English as the Haldeman Tract, my connection to the land is deeply rooted. But it is also a connection intertwined with ecological harm resulting from colonial practices, such as Western farming techniques and extractive agricultural systems. I grew up surrounded by the beauty and the violence of rural landscapes, shaped by settler colonialism, lands cleared, fenced, and planted for monocultures. On the screen is a color photograph of a field on my family's farm, where it often feels like the sky can go on forever over the tops of corn waving in the breeze. For years, I have observed changing weather patterns foreshadowing larger climatic and ecological changes. Wetter springs, drier summers, the disappearance of certain migratory birds, and the relentless spread of species often referred to as invasive across the fields I knew as a child. I've watched as once-in-a-lifetime and unprecedented natural disasters occur over and over again, and I've doom-scrolled my way through books and news articles and academic publications, warning of what's to come. It is from this entangled and felt experience of positionality that this research emerged. And this is why methodology matters so much in this project. It wasn't just about selecting appropriate theory and methods to generate data. It was about crafting a methodological orientation capable of holding these layered and intersecting histories and affects, of making space for grief, discomfort, and relationality without tidying them up. I needed a methodology that could hold both the intimate and the systemic, the human and the more than human, the personal and the political, without forcing them into binaries or hierarchies. What I want to emphasize here is that methodology for me was never just a set of tools to apply. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of staying with difficult feelings, of making sense of embodied experiences, and remaining accountable to the places and people I research with. On the screen here is a color photograph taken at my research site, Black Creek Community Farm. It was taken in the fall on one of the many paths on the farm, and there are brightly colored leaves dotting the path and a wooden fence that separates the path from the chicken coop. Before I describe what I mean by critical posthuman ethnography, I want to pause for a moment to describe the focus of my research and how this helped me craft my methodological path. Broadly, I am interested in how climate change makes people feel. Climate change, as defined by the United Nations, involves long-term changes in temperature and weather patterns caused by human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels. More than this, climate change is deeply intertwined with systems of power, such as settler colonialism, white supremacy, neoliberal capitalism, and eugenic logics, which transform the natural world into mere property and exploitable resources, while also hierarchically categorizing certain humans and non-humans as disposable in relation to others. Viewing climate change through this lens reveals it as a complex set of issues that requires humans to reconsider their relationships and emotional connections to our environments and the underlying systems of power that shape them. This entanglement has led to the emergence of what scholars have termed ecological emotions or climate emotions. Some of these include eco-anxiety, eco-rage, environmental melancholia, and what is increasingly known as ecological grief or eco-grief. While the emergence of this affective vocabulary marks an important cultural and scholarly shift, acknowledging that climate change is not only a material crisis, but also an emotional and relational one, the dominant response to these emotions has remained largely individualized. Within this framing, grief is positioned as a pathology to be treated, managed, or resolved, typically through therapeutic or psychiatric interventions. This individualizing tendency is not new. In North America, grief has long been understood, regulated, and contained through cultural norms that frame it as an individual and private experience. As Paul Rosenblatt argued, grief is rarely a singular emotion. It is a dynamic, unsettled, and often contradictory blend of sorrow, anger, depression, anxiety, fear, and confusion. And despite its inherent complexity and its social relational nature, dominant frameworks increasingly position grief as a condition to be diagnosed, monitored, and corrected. The recent edition of Prolonged Grief Disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders provides a striking example of this trend. It formalizes psychiatric norms around how long, how visibly, and in what manner grief may be acceptably expressed. Embedded within this classification is the assumption that grief should be temporary, private, and rational, subordinated to the demands of productivity and emotional self-regulation. Those who fail to manage their grief within these socially sanctioned timelines risk being labeled disordered. And this clinical turn is happening at the same time when happiness is framed as kind of a moral obligation. Sarah Ahmed and others have observed that contemporary Western societies increasingly treat positive affect as a civic duty. Within this framework, feelings like climate grief aren't just uncomfortable or difficult, they're suspect because they threaten the dominant narratives of hope, resilience, and individual coping. So far, emotions like eco-grief haven't been officially medicalized, but the expansion of psychiatric diagnoses suggests that this may not be far off. And this is especially concerning when we consider whose grief gets recognized and whose doesn't. Jennifer Poole and Carmen Galvin call this grief supremacy, a term that names how white supremacy structures grief cultures in order to privilege certain kinds of loss. Grief that fits within white, Western, middle-class, non-disabled norms is often seen as valid, while other griefs, especially those linked to systemic violences or ongoing colonial harms, are dismissed as excessive, illegible, or deviant. In this way, grief becomes a political resource, a means through which care, attention, and legitimacy are selectively distributed. Building on this, understanding who we mean when we say we requires a thoughtful approach. It means paying close attention to agency, not just of humans, but also the more than human beings all around us. It is through deepening these relationships that we begin to develop what Donna Haraway calls our responsibility, our ability to respond with care and awareness. So responsibility isn't just about those closest to us. It's about recognizing the wider web of relationships that we're a part of and that others are a part of too. The we that's affected by the climate crisis isn't a single universal group. It's not one size fits all. Instead, we have to account for differences. Differences in experience, in vulnerability, in the systems and power structures that we are entangled with. As Rosie Braidotti reminds us, we are in this together, but we are not one and the same. And so my questions became, how might we make space for eco-grief as something more than a private pathology or a momentary feeling? What kind of research methodology could hold eco-grief in all of its messiness and complexity? To answer this question, I turn to critical posthumanism and crypt theory. Together, they offered a way of understanding grief not as something to be fixed or solved, but as a site of becoming, a necessary and even generative disruption. These frameworks allowed me to take seriously the felt dimensions of living through climate change and to center emotional life not as a weakness or a failure to cope, but as a source of knowledge. I realized that if I wanted to explore climate grief as a relational political phenomenon, I needed a research methodology that could hold that complexity. I needed an approach that could attend to the relationality of grief and its entanglement with land, history, and more than humans. I needed one that could stay with the ambivalence and often contradictory nature of difficult emotions rather than trying to resolve them. And I needed one that could challenge the anthropocentrism of traditional research methodologies that tend to center the human experience as primary. So all of this led me to ask, as we humans and more than humans live through the sixth mass extinction and rapidly accelerating climate change, how might a relational theory-informed methodology help us grapple with the emotional dimensions of these entanglements? What would it mean to take seriously the agency of more than humans in health research, to account for difference, and to ask how emotions are produced in and through these relations? These are the questions that led me to develop what I call critical posthuman ethnography, a methodology that combines the relational focus of critical posthumanism and crypt theory with the grounded practices of ethnography to study emotional life. It's a methodology designed to hold grief, discomfort, ambivalence, and contradiction as generative and vital sources of knowledge. So when I first set out to explore how people experience eco-grief and other emotional responses to climate change, it quickly became clear that existing ethnographic approaches might not be enough. Traditional ethnography has tended to center human social relations, often leaving the more than human world invisible or treated as a passive background. Even some newer frameworks like One Health or EcoHealth, while acknowledging interconnectedness, can sometimes remain anthropocentric, preserving colonial hierarchies of value. In response, I developed what I call critical posthuman ethnography, a methodology that grows from critical posthumanism and crypt theory and builds on insights from multi-species ethnography. At its core, this approach insists that research must take seriously the entanglements between human and more than human lives, body, minds, emotions, histories, environments. It recognizes that knowledge doesn't only emerge from human cognition, but through embodied emotional and material interactions between people, soil, plants, weather, infrastructure, histories of land use, patterns of dispossession, and more. And I'll try now to sketch out some of its core methodological commitments. First, relationality as ontology and methodology. Following Karen Barad's concept of intra-action, this approach starts from the premise that no entity, whether human, plant, or landscape, pre-exists its relations. Things come into being through relation. So relationality isn't just the context for research, it's the very condition of its possibility. This means that our methodologies must be process-based and attuned to difference, not only across human identity categories, but also across species, environments, sensory experiences, and histories of violence and extraction. Second, it seeks to decenter the human. Building on multi-species ethnography, critical posthuman ethnography responds to critiques that multi-species work can sometimes depoliticize interspecies relations. Instead, it attends to how all beings co-produce research encounters. Soil, microbes, heat waves, and geese are all agentive. This approach also recognizes that researchers themselves are shaped by these entanglements. Emotions aren't purely internal, they emerge through our relations with more than human worlds. So decentering the human then isn't about ignoring the human experience as if we could ever fully remove ourselves, but about understanding that human subjectivity too is produced through these interactive relationships. Third, attending to affect, emotionality, and place. Emotionality is not a byproduct of climate change research, it's central to it. This includes grief, joy, ambivalence, exhaustion, and other affective states experienced both by participants and researchers. As Eve Tuck and Marcia Mackenzie, as well as Karen Barad remind us, emotions and material experiences are shaped by the specific places where they unfold, places layered with colonial, racial, and ecological histories. Methodologies must be attentive to the affective and material textures of those sites and how they shape what it's possible to know and feel. Fourth, embracing multiplicities of data and ways of knowing. Critical posthuman ethnography calls for a variety of data to hold the complexity of human more than human entanglements. It values creative, multimodal, emotionally engaged research practices that refuse neat boundaries. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it seeks to remain attentive to power, difference, and situated knowledges. Following Haraway, Braidotti, and scholars like Zoe Todd and Zakiya Iman Jackson, this approach resists flattening relationality into sameness. It insists that every relation unfolds within structures of power, including settler colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, and eugenic logics. Methodologies must grapple with how those forces shape whose grief, losses, and emotions are recognized and whose remain unacknowledged. Relationality is never neutral. It is historically produced, uneven, and politically consequential. In sum, critical posthuman ethnography offers one way to hold the tensions and contradictions of researching health in a time of ecological change. It resists tidy conclusions, insisting instead on making visible the emotional, material, and political entanglements shaping these challenges and the risks and possibility of studying them. It asks us to rethink what counts as data, how we relate to participants, human and more than humans, and how we attend to the sensory and emotional fabric of fieldwork. On the screen is a color photograph of the chalkboard in the outdoor classroom at Black Creek Community Farm. It's covered in an interconnected and overlapping series of multicolored lines and drawings. I conducted this research at Black Creek Community Farm, which is located in the Jane and Finch neighborhood of Toronto, a neighborhood that has been shaped by environmental degradation, a retrenchment of state support, and ongoing struggles for justice. As part of Toronto, the land where the farm sits was sold without fair compensation under Treaty 13 in 1805, and was later expropriated by the city in the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel in 1954, a climate disaster that reshaped some of Toronto's urban planning. In the decades since, part of this land has been reclaimed by community efforts grounded in food justice, environmental education, and collective care. Black Creek is a site where climate change is not abstract, but lived. Through food insecurity, a polluted watershed, oppressive temperatures caused by heat island effects, and the emotional labor of farming and its precarity. But it is also a space of laughter, joy, and shared meals. It is a profoundly sensuous research site. The overwhelming smell of tomatoes growing in polytunnels, the earthy scent of garlic scapes, the feel of sweat on skin, the sound of starlings overhead and airplanes and trucks rumbling in the distance, monarch butterflies drift through pollinator beds, garlic and onions hang to dry in the pavilion, and volunteers swap stories while weeding carrots or harvesting rainbow chard. On the screen is a photograph of tomatoes in various stages of ripeness growing in one of the polytunnels. I spent and still spend many mornings and afternoons at the farm, harvesting, planting, pruning, composting, and listening. As the growing season shifted, so too did the affective terrain, the moods on the farm, the pace of labor, the rhythm of human more than human entanglement. This was not a sterile research environment. It was a place of burning sun and bursting tomatoes. To attune to this complexity, I used a constellation of methods, which included 135 hours of participant observation, 12 semi-structured interviews. Many of these were conducted while working or walking together on the farm, 270 digital photographs, 10 audio recorded soundscapes, and over 100 reflexive jottings, which attempted to capture the emotional, sensory, and atmospheric feel on the farm. These methods weren't designed to simply collect facts or record what people said. They were intended to capture how the air smelled after it rained, or how it feels when grief settles in your body after a difficult conversation, or how heat alters the pace of work. I made notes about the feel of tomato fuzz on my fingertips, or the sound that dry soil makes when it crunches underfoot. Soundscapes recorded birdsong, wind, and the ambient noise of an urban farm. Airplane engines, the sound of shovels, the hum of traffic. Together, these were not separate points of data, but affective currents within a research assemblage. In this research, ethics wasn't a checkbox, but an evolving practice shaped by the relationships and emotional currents of the farm. Before generating any data, I spent months building trust and relationships, working alongside staff and volunteers, joining in planting days and harvesting shifts, and in market sales. Consent too was ongoing. It wasn't a one-time form, but a continual conversation. I offered participants the option to see interview questions in advance. Some used this to reflect privately. One person came with their responses typed on their laptop, which I understood as a gesture of self-care given the emotional weight of these conversations. A few declined to participate, and a few others never responded. And their silence spoke volumes. It taught me about refusal, emotional labor, and the limits of access. This approach was grounded in critical disability studies, which reminds us that access isn't one size fits all, and that emotional and cognitive labor in research must be supported. I provided honorariums and created conditions of care and flexibility wherever possible. But ethics couldn't stop with human participants. I had to ask, what are my responsibilities to more than human others? What does it mean to photograph a squash, to record a birdsong, to document a windstorm? Can we treat more than humans as participants in a research encounter? This question pushed me to think more critically about access. Max Lieberand reminds us that colonialism isn't just about harm, it's about entitlement. Settlers are granted ongoing, normalized access to land and resources, even under the guise of care. Similarly, Kim Tallbear cautions against expecting plants or animals to reveal themselves. They might, but they are not required to do so. Assuming they owe us their presence or their stories is to reproduce settler logics of entitlement. And so throughout my dissertation, I tried to hold this tension, the desire to understand, to generate, to interpret, and the responsibility to ask whether I should. I know that I remain shaped by settler habits of thought that I am still learning to recognize and undo. So guided by Talbert and Libron, I tried to stay with that discomfort, with the impossibility of fully knowing, and the need to approach more than human worlds with humility and without assuming access. These are questions and tensions that continue to shape my work and trouble me in generative ways. On the screen is a color photograph featuring a variety of plants. In the foreground, there's Queen Anne's lace and common milkweed, and there's a tiny snail sitting on the edge of the milkweed leaf. Like many qualitative researchers, I began the process of analysis with coding. I uploaded my transcripts, my reflexive jottings, my image descriptions and audio descriptions into Max QDA, and predictably themes emerged. Emotions, justice, human, more than humans, connection, capitalism, colonialism, prepping, embodiment, and others. But very quickly I found myself frustrated. The process of coding broke the data into fragments, isolating words and phrases from the relational and emotional conditions in which they had been produced. What was I meant to do with a soundscape of starlings, airplane engines in the distance, or shoveling? Where did the photograph of a green cabbage, like the one on the screen, belong? Coding privileged the known. It favored what was nameable and already legible within my conceptual frames. But my research moved in a different direction. It engaged with the unpredictable, the atmospheric, the lingering textures of emotion and relationality. These kinds of knowledges surfaced not just in the transcripts, in words and phrases, or in the silences between them, but also in the heat of an early morning planting session, or in that collective groan that volunteers release when they're stretching sore muscles after harvesting arugula. And so I needed another way in. I turn to what I call composting with theory, a messy, recursive, and affectively attuned process inspired by Donna Haraway's metaphor of compost. Instead of moving in a linear process from data to codes to findings, I immersed myself in theory and data simultaneously, letting each ferment, decay, and reshape the other. So for example, on bus rides to the farm, I listened to Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, or the research-focused podcast, Thinking Aloud. After jotting notes about grief, I reread Sarah Ahmed. While weeding carrots, I talked through theories of collective care and mutual aid. I revisited old field notes alongside new articles on climate grief and colonialism. Composting with theory aligns closely with Jackson and Mazai's concept of reading the data while thinking the theory, not applying theory as a fixed template, but allowing theory and data to rub up against each other. Composting with theory means embracing contradiction and complexity. It creates a rich, tangled matter, a kind of intellectual soil from which new insights can slowly grow. For me, this meant working with a mix of predetermined concepts like Barad's interaction, or Ahmed and Braidati's framings of affect and emotion, or Robert McClure and Alison Kafer's contributions to crypt theory, alongside more new and emerging concepts like prepping, mutual aid, and crypt pessimism. Together, these helped me to ask new and unexpected questions. Practically speaking, composting meant gathering and layering ideas from many sources: podcasts, long walks, reading groups, conversations, book talks, and literal time spent in fields. But it also meant giving those ideas time to settle, to decompose, to transform. This happened while laying on the grass by the Humber River, or during trips to my family's farm, or even through everyday rituals of procrastination, what I like to call procrasticleaning. This slow process of layering and turning, of adding heat and allowing to settle, enabled theory and data to merge and reshape the questions that I was asking. For example, could image descriptions reveal how settler common sense naturalizes dominant narratives of land? Could poetic transcription make visible our capacity to respond to the many others that we are entangled with? And how might grief act as an invitation to new ways of relating, to land, to history, to each other? In the end, composting with theory was messy, but when the mix and the conditions are right, it transforms into something unexpected and generative. Composting with theory helped me to continue to reframe ecological grief, not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition that shaped the research itself. Grief was not something I observed at a distance. It became part of the methodological terrain that I was navigating. Rather than isolating grief as a singular emotion or coding it as a data point, I began to notice how grief worked as a force within the research process, shaping what questions felt urgent, what stories emerged, and how meaning was made. It showed up in the pace of work, in the moments of silence, in participants' hesitations, and in my own affective responses. For many participants, some racialized and disabled, the grief associated with climate change wasn't new. It echoed longer histories of instability, state abandonment, and systemic neglect. What emerged wasn't only the loss of ecosystems and biodiversities. It was grief for what had never been offered: clean water, stable housing, safety, the right to rest, or simply the ability to plan for the future. This reframing helped me understand grief as structurally situated and relationally produced, not only as a response to climate change, but as part of the emotional texture of life under layered conditions of injustice. In this sense, grief wasn't just an object of study. It became methodological atmosphere. It asked for a slower pacing, a wider frame, an openness to what remains unresolved. It shaped how I listened, my analysis, and how I stayed in relation to those involved in the research process. And it reminded me that emotion isn't a side effect of research, it's part of the work itself. On the slide is a color photograph taken on an early November morning. In the foreground are the closed umbels of Queen Anne's lace, and in the background there are raised metal beds and a collection of various deciduous trees. As I've mentioned, this project was never intended to offer neat conclusions. Instead, it continues to generate questions that shape how I think about research as a way of being in relation. Some of these questions are ethical, some are political, and some are methodological. They ask not just what we study, but how we study, with whom, and at what cost. As Donna Haraway reminds us, it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And so I've been asking myself, what kind of worlds are my methods making? What forms of attention do they cultivate? Are they tuned in to what's already familiar, already legible? Or can they notice what resists interpretation, what refuses to be made meaningful? And at the same time, I've come to realize that not everything wants or needs to be interpreted. Some stories are not mine to tell. Some encounters are not metaphors. Sometimes movement is just movement. And I often return to questions of accountability, especially as a settler researcher working on stolen land. What responsibilities do I hold to the layered histories, ecologies, and relations that shape the places I work? Not everything human or more than human is available to be researched. This requires methodologies rooted in humility, reciprocity, and respect. And I'm starting to recognize that for me, accountability doesn't end when data generation does. It extends beyond publication, beyond grant timeline. And so I've been asking myself what it means to remain in relation, not as a requirement, but as a reciprocal form of care. These reflections have also prompted me to think about how we hold space for discomfort and failure, for doubt, for interruption, and for the mistakes that we will inevitably make as researchers. To be methodologically open isn't about having control. It's about allowing ourselves to be undone. On the screen is a close-up of the ground that's covered in frost-edged leaves and plants. So these aren't questions that I've resolved. They're questions that follow me. And I'd like to close by sharing a few questions that I hope might follow you too, not as a checklist, but as an invitation. What kinds of emotional states shape your research practices? When you return to your field notes, your transcripts, your images, what feelings surface? And what if those feelings aren't just personal reactions, but methodological forces? How do your methods relate to the more than human? What stories or beings are being centered and which ones remain unrecognized? What becomes possible when we widen our field of attention? What might composting look like in your field, your discipline, or your work? If you stopped striving for clarity and coherence, what might be allowed to rot? And what new forms could emerge from that mess? And what does accountability look like for you in your work? How do you remain accountable to communities, lands, or ecologies that your research touches? I know for myself, I don't always answer these questions well, and I still sometimes catch myself defaulting to citation over reciprocity, to coding over composting, but they help me remember that methodology doesn't end with a finished product. It's ongoing, it's relational, and it's full of possibility. On the screen is a color photograph of Echinacea purpurea, also known as a purple cone flower. Its petals are downcast and its flower head is prominent. I'll end the talk here, but I would like to again thank the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research. I am so deeply honored to have received the Joan Eakin Award for Methodological Excellence. I'm grateful to be here with all of you today. Thank you.